I remember that evening down to the smallest detail. The day on the construction site had been brutal, heat, dust, and concrete. My hands ached and my shirt stuck to my body, soaked in sweat. I rode home on an old bus, staring at my rough, calloused hands, thinking about one thing, how to make ends meet, but at home there was nothing waiting for me but bills and silence. That night, I decided to go to work at the club. It wasn't the proudest chapter of my life, but I needed the money. I had grown used to the looks, sometimes admiring, sometimes judgmental, sometimes critical, but this was how I earned my living. That evening, the club was packed, but I immediately felt her gaze. She was sitting at the back of the room, and her eyes were different from the others. They weren't just looking at me. No, it was deeper than that. It was as if she could see who I really was, even as I stood there in my unbuttoned shirt, playing a role for all those people. When my number ended, she stayed. Usually the audience would disperse or leave, but she waited. That intrigued me. Honestly, that night, for the first time, I wanted to approach someone after my performance. I still remember stepping out from backstage, already changed, but still with drops of sweat on my neck. I walked to her table and, exhaling the last remnants of nervousness, said, "You're not the type to come here by accident, are you?" She looked up, smiled slyly, and replied, "And you don't seem like the type to stay here for long." Her voice was low and warm, and my throat went dry instantly. We started talking, though in my head I kept wondering, why is she here? Why did she look at me as if she already knew me? She told me she had just dropped in with a friend, but the friend had left, and she stayed because she was curious about me. We sat together all evening. She listened to me like no one else ever had, not just nodding as others did, but really listening. And her gaze, damn, it was almost scorching. After our conversation at the club, I walked her to the exit. The night was warm, the air filled with the scent of asphalt after a recent rain, and I stood next to her, nervously shifting my keys in my pocket. She threw a glance at me over her shoulder and said teasingly, "So, are you going to show me what you can do off stage?" I laughed, trying to hide my embarrassment, and raised my hand to hail a cab. The car pulled up to the curb, and I opened the door, gesturing for her to get in. She smiled, her fingers brushing against my hand as she stepped inside. That small touch made my heart skip a beat. I got in beside her, and the cab pulled away. Inside, it was quiet, with only an old blues song playing softly on the radio. We drove through dark streets, and I felt the tension between us growing. I glanced sideways at her. She was leaning back in the seat, but her eyes spoke more than any words. She knew I was watching, and damn it, it only seemed to amuse her more. "Are you always this quiet?" she suddenly asked, turning to me. I smiled slightly and leaned closer, trying not to think about the driver witnessing this. "Only when I don't want to ruin anything," I replied. She laughed, and then suddenly she leaned in closer, her face just inches from mine. Her breath was warm, and her slightly parted lips seemed to call me. "Then stop thinking," she whispered. And I stopped. I just cupped her face in my hands and kissed her. The kiss was bold, hungry, almost desperate. Her lips were soft, with a faint taste of the wine she'd had at the club. I felt her fingers glide to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. The world outside the cab disappeared. It was just us, her scent, her warmth. The car stopped at a traffic light, but neither of us paid attention. It was more than just a kiss. It was a promise that this night would stay with us forever. When the cab stopped in front of her house, she smiled at me with the same playful confidence as before. "Maybe you should come inside," she asked, raising an eyebrow slightly. I smiled back, knowing this night wouldn't end with just words. I didn't answer right away. My mind raced with thoughts of her gaze, her lips, the way she drew me in, but I already knew there was no turning back. "I'll come in," I said, trying to sound calm, though my heart was pounding wildly. She smiled, took my hand, and we stepped out of the cab. Her fingers were warm and steady. The house was small, modest, but cozy. She opened the door, turned on the lights, and a soft, warm glow filled the room, reflecting in her eyes. "Well, Channing," she said, taking off her jacket and tossing it onto the couch, "are you always this serious, or is it just with me?" I took a step forward, locking onto her gaze. There was less than a meter between us, and the tension grew again. "Maybe you just throw me off balance," I replied, stepping closer. She laughed, but her laugh was more of a challenge than amusement. I decided not to give her another chance to tease me. In one swift motion, I pulled her to me, our bodies pressing together, and I felt her lips again. This kiss was even more intense than in the cab. Her hands slid down my back, gripping my shirt as if she wanted to tear it off. She stepped back for a moment to look at me, and I noticed how her gaze softened but remained just as confident. She took my hand and led me to another room, the bedroom. There was a small table with books, a lamp casting a warm glow, and a large window where moonlight streamed in. She stopped in front of me, tilted her head slightly, and whispered, "Show me what you can do. No stage, no audience, just for me." I didn't make her wait. I leaned in, kissed her neck, and felt her arch toward me. At that moment, the whole world focused on this room, on this moment. She saw me as more than just a man with calloused hands and a tired look. She saw me as someone real, someone worth knowing, and that feeling was more powerful than anything I had ever known. That night was special. Every second with her felt like it was stolen from another reality, but the most exciting part of what happened next, I've saved for those who want to know more. The steamy continuation of this story awaits you on my Patreon. Click the link in the description and dive into the most intimate and passionate moments I've left just for you.